The cold Montana wind bit through Vincent Hargrove's worn leather jacket as he pushed through the swinging saloon doors of Lillian's watering hole. His eyes went straight to the far corner. His corner. For 8 long years, that table had been his refuge, a small island of quiet in a sea of laughter, drunken songs, and the clatter of boots. It was the only place he could sit with his back to the wall and his face to the door, the way old lawmen did, and Vincent had once been one of those. "Evening, Vince." Lillian called from behind the bar, already pouring his usual whiskey. She didn't need to ask. Nobody ever had to ask with Vincent. His routine never changed. He nodded in reply, his movements slow and deliberate, a man carved from habit and silence. His tall frame moved with the weary grace of someone who had spent more of his life on horseback than on solid ground. At 34, Vincent looked older. The lines around his eyes were deep from years squinting into sun and dust, and from the weight of memories that refused to die. "Stew's almost ready," Lillian added as he took his seat. "Same as always." "Much obliged," he murmured. Vincent Hargrove didn't talk much. Not to Lillian, not to anyone. Most days, he spoke more to his horse, Samson, than he did to another soul. But in a mining town like Silverdale, that made him just another mystery in a place full of them. The saloon buzzed with noise and heat that didn't reach his corner. Laughter rose from the card tables, boots scraped the floor, and someone tuned a fiddle near the hearth. Vincent ate alone, as he always did, his mind drifting somewhere far from the noise. He had once worn a deputy's badge years ago in Denver, until one terrible day had driven him out to the edge of the Montana territory, where no one asked questions, and solitude was easy to come by. Lillian brought over a steaming bowl of beef stew and a slice of bread. "On the house," she said with a smile that carried more pity than flirtation. He nodded, picked up his spoon, and began eating in silence. Then the door opened again, letting in a sharp gust of cold air, and with it came something that didn't belong. A woman. Every conversation seemed to slow for a heartbeat. She stood framed in the doorway, the fading light behind her. Her travel dress was green, a little too fine for a town like Silverdale, dusted from the road but still proper. A small leather valise hung from one gloved hand, and her chestnut hair had half escaped from its bun. Vincent meant to look away, but he didn't. Something about the way she carried herself. Calm, composed, like a woman used to walking into rooms where she didn't quite belong, caught him off guard. She spoke quietly to Lillian at the bar, who nodded toward the rooms upstairs, then gestured around the saloon. The woman's gaze swept the room, searching for a place to sit. Every table was full. Every table except Vincent's. He looked down quickly, pretending to be focused on his stew. Maybe she'd take the hint and sit elsewhere, but he knew better before he even heard her footsteps. "Excuse me," she said. Her voice was clear, confident, and somehow out of place in a room full of rough men and cigarette smoke. "Would you mind if I joined you? Every other table seems to be taken." Vincent's spoon froze halfway to his mouth. He looked up slowly, meeting her hazel eyes. They were steady, with little flecks of gold that caught the lamplight. He should have said no. He always said no. But for reasons he couldn't explain, the word stuck in his throat. "Suit yourself," he muttered instead. "Thank you." She placed her small case by the chair and sat down without hesitation, arranging her skirts neatly. "Penelope Greenfield," she said, offering her hand. "I've just arrived on the afternoon stage." "Vincent Hargrove," he said, shaking it briefly before returning to his stew. "A pleasure, Mr. Hargrove." Lillian appeared a moment later, placing a plate of stew and a cup of tea before her. "On the house for our new schoolteacher," she said, eyes twinkling. "Thank you kindly," Penelope said with a polite smile. Vincent's brow lifted. "Schoolteacher?" "Yes, I'm taking over the schoolhouse this week," she replied cheerfully. "I understand the last teacher left rather suddenly." Vincent nodded. That's one way to put it. He remembered that story. The old teacher had run off after a scandal with a local widow. "Town needs a teacher," he added quietly. "I hope I'll do," she said with a small smile. They ate in silence for a few moments. Vincent expected her to eat quickly and leave, but she didn't. "Is the stew always this good?" she asked, breaking the quiet. "It's reliable." Penelope's lips curved. "That's high praise, I take it." Vincent looked up at her, unsure whether she was teasing him. Her tone was light, but there was a glint in her eyes. Humor, maybe. It had been so long since anyone had looked at him like that, without judgment or fear. "And what is it you do, Mr. Hargrove? Rancher, I'd guess." "Yes. Small spread east of town. Cattle, mostly." "Honest work," she said approvingly. "I've always admired people who make their living from the land. It takes strength and patience." Quote, Vincent gave a small grunt that might have been agreement. Penelope took another bite of stew, then looked at him again. "Do you always eat alone?" The question hit harder than she probably intended. Vincent stared into his glass for a moment. Easier that way. For whom? He glanced up, startled by her quiet challenge. She wasn't mocking him. She just wanted to understand. Before he could think of an answer, Lillian approached with the bill. "You want me to put it on your tab, Vince?" Vincent stood. "No, I'll settle." He left a few coins on the table, nodded to Penelope. "Miss Greenfield." "Mr. Hargrove," she replied. Her voice was calm, but her eyes followed him as he left. Outside, the wind had grown colder, sharp against his skin as he stepped into the street. He pulled his hat low and walked toward the hitching post, where Samson waited patiently. 8 years of eating alone, of talking to no one but his horse. And tonight, a woman had sat down and somehow gotten him to speak more words than he had in months. It shouldn't matter. She was new, a stranger, a passing piece of color in a quiet man's life. She'd teach the school children, maybe live in town a year or two, and then move on. But as Vincent rode back toward his lonely ranch under the Montana stars, her voice echoed in his mind. Soft, steady, curious. "Do you always eat alone?" He didn't have an answer. And for the first time in 8 years, Vincent Hargrove wasn't sure he wanted to eat alone ever again. Morning broke cold and bright over the Montana plains. Vincent Hargrove was already awake before the first hint of sunlight touched the horizon. He'd been up since before dawn, tending to the horses, checking the fences, and trying, unsuccessfully, to push one particular woman from his thoughts. He stood on his porch with a steaming tin cup of coffee, watching the frost sparkle on the grass. The air was still, save for the distant lowing of cattle. Out here, silence had always been his companion. He'd once found peace in it. Now, for the first time in years, it felt heavy. He tried to convince himself it was just curiosity. She was new in town, that was all. But his mind kept returning to her, the confidence in her voice, the warmth in her eyes, the way she hadn't flinched from his silence, like everyone else did. By mid-morning, Vincent gave up pretending. He told himself he needed supplies, coffee, nails, maybe some flour. A man couldn't run a ranch without the essentials. But as he saddled Samson and turned the horse toward Silverdale, he knew the truth. He wanted to see her again. The town was just waking up when he arrived. Smoke curled from chimneys, and the sound of wagons echoed along Main Street. As he passed the general store, he spotted the small white schoolhouse at the far end of town, its windows thrown open, sunlight glinting on the glass. He hadn't meant to ride that way. His hands had guided Samson there on their own. Through the open doorway, he saw her. Penelope Greenfield stood on a chair, reaching for a high shelf, a stack of books teetering dangerously in her arms. Beside her, Mrs. Martha Jenkins, who ran the general store, looked on with a mixture of amusement and concern. Vincent dismounted before he could talk himself out of it. "Afternoon, ladies," he said, stopping at the doorway. Penelope turned so suddenly she nearly lost her balance. "Mr. Hargrove!" she gasped, one hand flying to steady herself. He caught the back of the chair with one hand before it tipped. "Careful!" Her cheeks flushed. "Thank you," she said, stepping down. "I didn't expect company." "Didn't mean to intrude," he said. "Just saw you working and thought I'd check if you needed a hand." Martha's eyes gleamed with mischief. "Well now, isn't that neighborly?" she said. clearly delighted by the sight of the usually silent rancher making a social call. Penelope smiled faintly, brushing dust from her skirt. "We're just trying to get the books in order, but I can't reach the top shelves." "I can't reach them," Vincent said simply, and so he did. For the next hour, he stacked and sorted books under her quiet direction. She talked as she worked about her students who would be arriving soon, about her plans to repair the leaky roof and paint the walls before winter. Vincent listened, nodding now and then, surprised to find that her voice calmed him. When they finished, she stepped back to admire the neat rows of books. "Thank you, Vincent," she said. "You've been very kind." He shrugged. "No trouble." She tilted her head, studying him. "Do you ever go to church, Mr. Hargrove?" "Not lately," he admitted. "You should come this Sunday," she said. "It's a good way to meet folks." He almost laughed. "I've lived here 8 years, Miss Greenfield. I've met everyone I need to." Penelope's eyes softened. "Maybe, but it doesn't hurt to be reminded you're part of a community." He didn't answer. The idea of sitting through a church service surrounded by people whispering behind his back made his stomach knot. Still, something about the way she said it lingered. She glanced at the ceiling, frowning. "The roof's leaking again. I'll have to hire someone." "I'll take a look," Vincent offered without thinking. "I've patched a few in my time." Penelope blinked. "Oh, I couldn't impose." "You're not imposing," he interrupted. "I've got spare shingles and tools at my place. I'll come by after church." She smiled, a real, warm smile that reached her eyes. "Then I suppose I'll see you Sunday morning." Vincent tipped his hat and left before she could see the way his heart was hammering. Sunday came sooner than he expected. Vincent spent more time than he'd admit, shaving, polishing his boots, and knotting a tie he hadn't worn in years. When he caught his reflection in the mirror, he almost didn't recognize the man looking back, one who seemed younger, less tired. "This is foolish," he muttered. But he didn't stop. He saddled Samson and rode into town, arriving at the Pleasant Valley Hotel just as the church bells began to ring. Penelope stepped out onto the porch, dressed in a deep blue gown and a small hat adorned with a ribbon. She was radiant. "Good morning, Vincent," she said with that same easy warmth. "Morning," he replied, offering his arm awkwardly. "Church is this way." She accepted it without hesitation, and they walked together down the dusty street. People turned to watch, some smiling, others whispering. Vincent ignored them, focusing instead on the soft sound of her voice as she spoke about her students and plans for the school. At the church, Reverend Walsh greeted them both, clearly surprised to see Vincent. "Well, Mr. Hargrove," he said with a grin, "it's been some time since we've seen you here." "Thought I'd make an appearance," Vincent said dryly. The service was simple but warm, filled with hymns and laughter. Penelope sang softly beside him, her voice carrying just enough for him to hear. It stirred something deep inside him, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Afterward, the Reverend introduced Penelope to the congregation, praising her for reopening the school. She spoke briefly, her words graceful and sure. Vincent watched her, pride swelling unexpectedly in his chest. When the service ended, she found him waiting by the door. "Ready to look at that roof?" she asked. He nodded, grateful for the excuse to escape the curious stares. Together, they walked to the schoolhouse. Vincent examined the roof while Penelope pointed out the trouble spots. "A few missing shingles, loose flashing," he said. "I can fix it tomorrow." "How much do I owe you for the materials?" she asked. "Nothing," he said firmly. "I've got plenty." "I insist." He looked at her, really looked at her, the determination in her chin, the honesty in her eyes, and found himself smiling faintly. "You don't take no easy, do you?" "Not when I believe in something," she said lightly. Vincent climbed down from the ladder and met her gaze. "Then I'll see you tomorrow after church. We'll get it fixed before the snow." She nodded. "And thank you, Vincent, for everything." He touched the brim of his hat. "Welcome to Silverdale, Miss Greenfield." As he rode home that evening, the sound of her laughter still lingered in his ears. He'd come to town for supplies. At least, that's what he told himself. Instead, he found himself volunteering for church, offering to fix a stranger's roof, and thinking about the way her eyes had softened when she said his name. Something was changing. He could feel it. For 8 years, Vincent Hargrove had lived like a ghost, but now, for the first time in a long while, he felt alive again. Snow fell soft and slow over the Montana Valley, blanketing the world in white. Vincent Hargrove stood outside his small ranch house, watching the flakes settle on the fence posts and the roofs of the outbuildings. It was peaceful, the kind of quiet he had always loved. But now, as he stood there with his gloved hands shoved deep into his coat pockets, that quiet no longer felt like comfort. It felt like waiting. He glanced at the sleigh hitched in front of the barn, the runners polished, the horses restless. Inside, a small fire burned low, warming a house that, for the first time, no longer felt empty. Penelope Greenfield had promised to visit after the first snowfall. And Vincent, though he would never admit it out loud, had been waiting for this day all week. When he finally heard the faint jingle of the stage coming up the road, his heart quickened. A few minutes later, she stepped down, wrapped in her blue wool coat, cheeks pink from the cold, her eyes bright as the winter sky. "You really came," Vincent said, taking her suitcase before she could protest. "You doubted I would?" she teased. "Wasn't sure anyone would ride out this far just for a cup of coffee?" She smiled, that familiar soft smile that had undone him since the first day she'd sat across from him in the saloon. "Then, I suppose I'll have to make it worth your while." Inside, the house glowed with firelight. The air smelled of pine and coffee. Penelope looked around, her eyes full of quiet admiration. "It's exactly what I imagined," she said. "Strong, simple, peaceful." "It's just home," Vincent said, setting her suitcase by the hearth. "Nothing fancy." She turned to him, her gaze warm. "Home suits you, Vincent." They shared dinner together, a simple meal of venison and potatoes. The conversation flowed easily now, the way it always did with her. She spoke of her students, their eagerness, their mischief, their dreams. He told her about the ranch, the horses, the work that filled his days. When they finished eating, Penelope moved closer to the fire, rubbing her hands for warmth. "Do you ever think about leaving?" she asked softly. "Leaving Silverdale?" She nodded. "You've been here so long, living alone. Don't you ever wonder what's beyond all this?" Quote. Vincent stared into the fire for a long moment before answering. "Used to. Now I just wonder who'd feed the horses if I did." Penelope laughed, a light, musical sound that filled the room. "You hide behind that gruffness, Mr. Hargrove, but I see through it." He raised an eyebrow. "You do, huh?" "Yes," she said. "You're a good man. Better than you think you are." That simple truth hit him harder than he expected. He stood and crossed the small distance between them. "You ever get tired of talking to a man who doesn't say much?" Quote. "Not yet," she whispered. For a moment, neither spoke. The fire crackled softly. Outside, the wind brushed against the windows. Then Vincent reached for her hand, rough fingers closing gently around her gloved ones. "Penelope," he said, his voice low, unsteady. "I've spent years keeping folks at a distance. Told myself I was better off that way. But since you sat down at my table, nothing's been the same. You've got me thinking about things I swore I'd buried for good. Laughter, company, maybe even happiness." Her eyes shimmered in the firelight. "Vincent, I'm no good with speeches," he said, "but I know one thing. I don't want to spend another winter eating alone." She reached up and touched his face lightly. "Then don't," she said simply. He leaned down, kissing her gently, a kiss that spoke of gratitude, hope, and the quiet promise of something new. For a man who had once thought he was done with love, it felt like coming back to life. Weeks passed, the snow deepened, and with it came change. Vincent began spending more time in town, helping Penelope with the school whenever she needed an extra pair of hands. The townsfolk noticed. Some smiled knowingly. Others whispered, but for once, Vincent didn't care. The man who had once been a ghost now laughed, joined conversations, even lingered in Lillian's saloon after supper instead of rushing home to silence. He and Penelope grew closer with each passing day, their friendship shifting, deepening, becoming something neither could quite deny. On Christmas Eve, the town gathered in the small white church for a candlelit service. Snowflakes drifted past the windows, catching the soft glow of lamplight. Penelope led the children's choir, their small voices rising in sweet, imperfect harmony. Vincent sat near the back, hands folded, his eyes never leaving her. When the final hymn ended and the townsfolk began to disperse, Penelope approached him, cheeks flushed, eyes shining. "You came," she said softly. "Wouldn't have missed it," he replied. They stepped outside together, the cold air sharp and clean. The moon hung full and silver over the valley, casting long shadows on the snow. "Beautiful night," Penelope said. Vincent nodded. "Best one I've seen in a long time." Quote. She turned toward him then, her gloved hand brushing his. "Vincent, what made you come tonight?" He hesitated, searching for words. "You," he said finally. "You made me remember what it feels like to belong somewhere." She smiled, and before he could lose his courage, Vincent took her hand in both of his. "I've lived alone too long, Penny. Too many nights with nothing but the wind for company. I don't want that anymore. I want this." Penelope's eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of joy. "And what exactly is this?" she asked gently. "This," Vincent said, his voice rough, "is me asking if you'll share the rest of your days with a quiet, stubborn rancher who doesn't know much about love but knows he wants to learn with you." Her smile trembled as she whispered, "Yes, Vincent, I'll share them all." He pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her as snow fell silently around them. The town's bells rang faintly in the distance. But for Vincent, the world had narrowed to one simple truth. He wasn't alone anymore. Months later, spring swept across Silverdale. The hills bloomed with wildflowers, and laughter echoed from the little schoolhouse where Penelope taught, her wedding band gleaming in the sunlight. Every evening, when the day's work was done, Vincent would ride home to find her waiting on the porch. Sometimes they'd talk, sometimes they'd just sit in quiet, watching the sun melt into the horizon. And every now and then, when she set 2 plates on the table and smiled that gentle, knowing smile, he'd think back to the first night he saw her walk into Lillian's saloon. The night a lonely cowboy's life changed forever. For 8 long years, Vincent Hargrove had eaten alone. Then one woman sat down without asking and turned his silence into a story worth living.